Political turmoil, global geopolitical conflict, civil rights protests, impeachment trials, a rise in political violence that includes the assassinations of prominent political figures. I'm, of course, talking about the landscape that the United States finds itself in the late 60s and early 70s. What? What is there another time period that all that's happening in? Today? That stuff's going on today? Y'all, I'm Blake Watson, your resident dramaturg here with our second video in this series on Pippin. This time we're going to be focusing on the historical moment the show was written in, and how that affected the show itself, and why exactly the political and cultural landscape of the time feels so uncannily familiar. Let's jump into it. As we covered in the last video, Stephen Schwartz developed Pippin alongside Roger Herson for about 5 years, before its Broadway debut in 1972. During that time period alone, so many significant, albeit terrifying, historical events occurred. Both Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and sitting New York Senator Robert F. Kennedy were assassinated within roughly 2 months of each other. And these weren't isolated incidents. Political violence had ballooned in this time. Both radical individuals with various motives and even larger organizations contributed to this glut of violence. But it wasn't just confined to the country either. The US was very intimately involved in an incredibly violent conflict in Vietnam. In 1969, the US's involvement in the Vietnam War reached its peak, with 543,000 military personnel stationed in the country. All the while, it became increasingly unpopular with the American people. In October of 1969, a Gallup poll showed that 58% of Americans surveyed thought the war was a mistake to enter into, while only 34% said it wasn't. Now, that might not seem overwhelming on its own, but it's really put in relief when you know that just 4 years prior, only 24% of Americans called the U.S. involvement a mistake, while a staggering 61% felt it was not a mistake to intervene. As millions of young men across the country watched TV to discover whether or not they were drafted, the country was increasingly convinced it was not a conflict they ought to be having a part of. At home, the country was also grappling with multiple movements for civil rights. Tensions between the dominant American culture, which largely served white heterosexual Christian men, and the groups who had been marginalized and oppressed started to boil over. Various movements sprung up fighting for a more equal place at the table of the American culture. The late 60s had many of these movements, like the civil rights movements fighting to dismantle Jim Crow-era policies. The second wave feminist movement also took shape in the decade, working to create legislation to ban gender discrimination and foster a more equitable environment for women. The disability rights movement came to a head later in the mid-70s with the 504 sit-in, a 25-day peaceful occupation of government offices across the country that eventually led to key disability legislation to be passed in 1977. But we don't have time to go through all those in detail. Let's take a look at one of those more specifically. Queer Americans also became activists and engaged in community building in the decade too, fighting back against oppressive police practices and forming the gay liberation movement in the process. In 1969, the police raided a Greenwich Village gay bar, the Stonewall Inn. The resulting protests from the patrons and surrounding queer demonstrators escalated into a multi-day riot, where demonstrators pushed back against growing police violence and persecution. This later became known as the Stonewall Uprising, or, more commonly, the Stonewall Riots. These events had a profound impact on queer organization and activism. Where it was once rare and risky to organize politically by sexuality, it became more and more common after seeing the fight by the patrons at Stonewall. It's considered by many as the birth of the gay liberation movement and brought about the first gay pride marches on the first anniversary of Stonewall, a practice that has evolved into the internationally celebrated pride parades you may be familiar with today. Stonewall is just one example of the kind of political activism that grew out of the turmoil of the 60s, which reflected a growing dissatisfaction with the dominant culture and with the government itself. Perhaps one of the most pivotal moments in eroding public trust in government was the Watergate Scandal. In June 1972, 5 men with ties to President Nixon's re-election campaign were arrested for breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Convention and attempting to wiretap DNC phones. The resulting scandal and cover-up eventually forced Nixon to resign by 1974 before his looming impeachment trial could take place. All of this ended his political career. This scandal also changed the way Americans view government and did long-lasting damage to public trust in major institutions. While this erosion in public trust caused many activist groups to organize and fight back against injustice and inequality, the large numbers of disaffected youth searching for purpose and meaning in an increasingly volatile political landscape also means that they turn to drugs, violence, and cults to try and find a place to fit in. One such drug-fueled New Age cult that took hold was the Manson family. In 1969, the country was shocked to hear that actress Sharon Tate had been murdered in her home, along with Abigail Folger, daughter and heiress to the Folgers Coffee Company, Wojciech Frykowski, Jay Sebring, and Stephen Parent. Tate was married to infamous film director Roman Polanski at the time, who was out of the country, and Tate was also 8 months pregnant with their child. It was later revealed that the murders were the work of the members of the Manson family. The group was headed by Charles Manson, a struggling musician and songwriter in California who created a commune that gathered mostly young women in various ranches across the state. Manson created a cult of personality around himself, drawing from Scientology, growing free love movements, biblical texts, and various other sources, creating an amalgam of beliefs that placed Manson himself at the center, with some members even claiming that he was an incarnation of Jesus Christ himself. Manson and his followers were also white supremacists, with Manson prophesizing a coming race war between the black and white people across the globe. He played into the white fears about civil rights and the perception that white America was going to be lost. He convinced them that only he could lead them through the race war unscathed, and following his every word would bring them salvation. This then leads to the Tate murders, as they later became known, with Manson instructing 3 of his followers to go to Tate's address and kill everyone present. The Manson family ultimately were responsible for at least 9 murders, with some estimates reaching as high as 24 deaths at their hands. The trials that resulted got national attention, as several members of the group were sentenced to death. Their sentences were ultimately commuted in 1972, when the death penalty was briefly outlawed in California. Manson himself died in prison in 2017. The motives for the group's crimes are still relatively unclear. Some at the time claimed that the murders were designed to exonerate Manson family member Bobby Beausoleil, who was being held for the murder of Gary Hinman. It was thought by members of the group that if similar murders occurred while Beausoleil was in custody, he might be cleared of the charges. Others believed that the murders and the other crimes could help incite the coming race war that Manson himself prophesied. However, any explanations of motives still feel unsatisfying. Ultimately, the violence remains as senseless and horrific today as it was then. The Manson family's criminal activity and convictions were very much a part of public consciousness when Pippin was being written. Bob Fosse titled the famous dance break of glory the Manson Trio. While the name doesn't appear anywhere in the script, that section often remains exactly as he choreographed it, and is always referred to as the Manson Trio. The Manson family serves as a pretty apt metaphor for the themes and ideas of the play. While many people found solace and community in the counterculture of the 60s, it was by no means universally positive. Charles Manson used the free love movement, drug use, and New Age religious beliefs to manipulate his followers into doing his bidding and convince them to commit unspeakable violence. He, much like the leading player in our story, was a charismatic leader putting on a persona in order to bend people to his will. The ending of the show really leans into the darker elements of the 60s counterculture and forces the audience to see just how easily impressionable young people without purpose can be drawn into dangerous circumstances and be unable or unwilling to see through the artifice and manipulation. So what does this all mean for us? Why should we care about all of these different pieces of history? Well, for one, any show you do is directly informed by the political moment of its writing, and Pippin is no exception. The U.S. wouldn't withdraw combat troops from Vietnam until early 1973, a full 3 months after Pippin premiered on Broadway. And the conflict didn't fully end until 2 years later, in April of 1975. The consequences of this war were still immediate, and the wounds were still fresh. For those of you who keep up with the news, this all might seem a little bit familiar. While the US hasn't sent any troops directly to intervene in the conflict between Palestine and Israel, it is complicit in the occupation as Israel's most powerful ally and supplier of arms and military support. Similarly to Vietnam, America's perception of the conflict has really shifted a lot lately, too. A new poll published September 29th in the New York Times shows us a familiar pattern. In 2023, 47% of Americans polled sided with Israel, while only 20% sided with Palestine. Today, the numbers tell a little bit of a different story. The recent data shows 34% siding with Israel and 35% with Palestine. Similarly, the number of people who believe that Israel is intentionally killing civilians rose from 22% in 2023 to 40% now. The American people have changed their minds about this conflict in the same way they changed their minds about Vietnam all those years ago.
There are a few things from that original recording that I felt didn't quite wrap up what I wanted to say. So, I thought I would just come on here and give you a more unscripted take on what my conclusions are for the history and context. The thing that's really interesting about plays and musicals, especially one like this, is that they very clearly reflect the time and place that they're written in. The 60s and 70s are hard-coded into the show because of the stuff that's going on at the time. Now, one of the interesting things about this show is that I think that it is maybe just as resonant or even more resonant now because the things going on in the 2020s have an odd mirroring to some of the things that were going on in the 60s and 70s. However, this is a big but to all of that. When you try and revive a show like this that has so much contextual information, so much of this is based on the period it's written, you get some weird conclusions where things don't quite line up. I'll give you an example. The song Glory is very clearly anti-war, and it's very clearly taking the stance of anti-war as it relates to Vietnam. That's what the audience was likely thinking about when they saw the show, and that's what the creators were likely referencing when they created it. In the 2020s, the Vietnam War is a lot less resonant of a subject for us, so unless we know that context, we're not going to immediately think about the Vietnam War. What we might think about instead is the conflict between Palestine and Israel. So, whether rightly or wrongly, the audience is no longer thinking about Vietnam. They're thinking about Palestine and Israel. Another example that comes to mind is when you think about Charlemagne's assassination, especially within the last few weeks, the audience is going to be thinking about a very different assassination than an audience might have even 5-10 years ago. Our relationship to political violence and assassination is very different today. Finally, I have one more thing that I think might illustrate my point here. In 1992, Dr. Jonathan Miller, who was a producer and theater director, gave a talk at San Diego State University, a talk that he titled The Afterlife of Plays. In it, he details the ways in which theater is a recursive medium. Anytime you do theater, it doesn't last, so it must constantly be reinvented and changed so that it appeals to modern contemporary audiences. He goes on a brief tangent in the speech where he talks about an art forger named Van Meegeren. Van Meegeren was a disgruntled artist who didn't have much traction, so he resorts to forgery. He forges some Vermeer paintings, and in 1938, he gets them appraised where they're deemed real. It's later found out that these are elaborate forgeries, but all of this to say, when you look at those paintings today, it's very hard to see why anybody thought that those were true Vermeers. The fact that they're counterfeit is obvious. The things that Van Meegeren thought were important to imitate and forge are not the same things that we value in Vermeer today. Quote, "What you see in Vermeer in 1938, what you cherish, and what you think is worth forging, what is worth bringing out if you're going to forge Vermeer is completely different to what you think is worth forging and bringing out in Vermeer in 1987. We cherish Vermeer for reasons that are very different from the reasons that they cherished Vermeer and thought it was worth forging him in 1938. And Jonathan Miller thinks the same thing about theater, too. The things we find resonant today are very different from the ones that audiences found resonant in 1972. I think the reason why a lot of this feels so familiar and fresh and modern is because the political and cultural conditions of the 70s are very similar to the ones that we're experiencing now in 2025. Although the one thing I'll say is that not everything is the same. There are some key differences, which is why some of the elements of the show simply don't hold up. I think that we today have much less fondness for the free love movements of the 60s and 70s, which is why I think those elements might not connect with a modern audience as much as the sections about political unrest, assassinations, and dissatisfaction with the dominant culture. The important thing when doing a show like this is that we have to know which elements will still resonate with our audience today and which we need to adjust and reevaluate and reimagine so that the audiences can have an experience that resonates with them as deeply as it did in 1972, even though we know the material conditions of the play are going to be vastly different. That's all I've got for you today. But check back again soon, because I'll have some more videos about the specific songs of Pippin and what those can tell us musically about the show. See you next time.